I am Rowan Hale, and I was 41 years old the Christmas I finally learned that cruelty doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, seated at a long table, smiling while it decides who deserves to belong. Before I go any further, please like, comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. This channel exists for people who have been overlooked, underestimated, or quietly hurt by those who were supposed to protect them. Every comment and share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear they're not alone. Every December, I ask myself the same question while loading the car. Should I really go? I asked it that morning as I folded sweaters and wrapped gifts. As I checked the weather twice like snow might give me an excuse not to leave. I asked it when I stood in the doorway of my daughter's room, watching her smooth her dress in the mirror with careful hands. And still, like I always did, I told myself yes. Christmas was for children, and Ellen deserved to see her family, even if that family had never been gentle with me. Ellen was 13 that year, caught in that fragile space between childhood and becoming. All long limbs and quiet observations. She moved through the world thoughtfully, like she was always aware she might take up too much space if she wasn't careful. She had chosen her dress weeks earlier, saving her allowance, asking my opinion only once before deciding for herself. It was a soft moss green, simple and elegant, the kind of dress that didn't shout for attention but still made you look twice. I wanted something that feels grown, she said, adjusting the sleeves. I told her she looked beautiful. She smiled, but I could see the nerves tucked just beneath it. The drive to Silverbrook Ridge was quiet. Snow lined the roads in careful rows, and the radio played old holiday songs neither of us sang along to. Ellen stared out the window, tracing patterns in the fogged glass. "Do you think Aunt Margaret will like it?" she asked suddenly, not looking at me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel for just a moment. "She doesn't get to decide that," I said carefully. "But yes, you look lovely." She nodded, accepting the answer without fully believing it. The house came into view like something lifted from a magazine spread. Perfectly symmetrical. White lights wrapped around the porch railings, not a single bulb out of place. A wreath hung at the center of the door, thick, lush, and expensive enough that I knew exactly how many grocery trips it represented. This was Margaret Hale Winslow's domain. My older sister had always loved order. Loved things that looked right from the outside. She married into money, settled into tradition, and wore her success like a tailored coat. To Margaret, presentation wasn't vanity, it was virtue. We parked at the curb, our modest sedan wedged between two luxury SUVs. Ellen hesitated before opening her door. "Ready?" I asked. She nodded again. Brave. Always brave. Inside, the house smelled like pine, cinnamon, and something floral I couldn't place. The floors gleamed so brightly I could see our reflections distorted beneath our feet. The Christmas tree stood tall and full, ornaments engraved with surnames and dates, family history etched in gold. This was a house that remembered everything, except people like me. Margaret greeted us with a tight smile, her lipstick flawless, her posture straight. She leaned in for an air kiss that never quite landed on my cheek. "Rowan," she said warmly without warmth. Ellen, Edward, her husband, shook my hand like we were meeting for the first time, not like he'd known me for over 20 years. His grip was firm, his smile polite, his eyes already scanning past us. Ellen said hello softly. Margaret glanced at her dress, just a flicker, then turned away mid-sentence to call out to someone else. I noticed. I always noticed. The living room filled slowly. Relatives gathered in neat clusters, laughter rising and falling in controlled waves. My mother, Vivian Hale, sat on the couch holding a mug she never drank from, her fingers wrapped tightly around it like it was something solid to cling to. My cousin Nora Beckett stood near the window, flipping through papers she didn't need to look at. People asked polite questions, how's work? How's school? But the answers floated away unanswered. No one leaned in. No one followed up. Dinner was announced, and we moved to the table like actors hitting their marks. Place cards waited neatly. Ellen's name sat at the far end, wedged between two adults who barely acknowledged her presence. I started to reach for her plate, ready to switch seats, but she shook her head slightly. "It's okay," she whispered. "I can sit there." I let her, and hated myself a little for it. As we sat down, something shifted. The laughter sounded thinner. Forks clinked too loudly against porcelain. I caught Margaret watching us from across the table, her smile fixed, her eyes sharp. Edward poured wine and cleared his throat. "Tradition," he said lightly. That's what Christmas is really about, isn't it? Honesty. Family truth. A few people laughed. My stomach tightened. Nothing had happened yet, but I felt it. In the way Ellen's shoulders stiffened. In the way my mother stared at the tablecloth instead of at me. In the way old memories stirred, reminding me that in this house, silence always came before damage. Edward leaned back in his chair, tapping his fork against his plate. "Well," he said, smiling as his eyes landed on Ellen. "I have to say, that's a creative dress choice." A pause, then a chuckle. You don't see budget fashion like that very often at a formal Christmas dinner. The laughter came in pieces. Cautious at first, then braver. Ellen's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Her cheeks flushed red, fast and deep, and she lowered her eyes to her plate. I opened my mouth, but Margaret spoke first. "Oh, Edward didn't mean anything," she said sweetly. "We just put a lot of effort into Christmas here. You know how important appearances are." She glanced at Ellen again. "Kids grow out of these phases, don't they?" More laughter. Someone murmured something about humility. Another voice added, character building. A distant relative said, "Well, Rowan's always done things her own way." Each comment landed softly on its own. Together, they crushed the air from the room. Ellen didn't cry. She didn't speak. She sat perfectly still, hands clenched around her utensils like they were the only things holding her in place. I waited. For someone to interrupt. For my mother to say enough. For Margaret to redirect the conversation. No one did. Plates kept moving. Wine glasses refilled. The moment rolled on like it had been scheduled. Edward shrugged, pleased with himself. "I'm just saying," he added. "First impressions matter. Colleges notice these things. Employers, too." He smiled at me. "You want the best for her, right?" Something inside me clicked. This wasn't awkward humor. This wasn't carelessness. It was planned. I reached for Ellen's hand beneath the table. She flinched slightly, then squeezed back hard. She was shaking. I scanned the table for help. My eyes landed on my mother. "Mom," I said quietly. She lifted her eyes for a second, just long enough to meet mine, then looked away. No nod. No shake of the head. Just silence. I turned to Nora next. We had grown up together. I had slept on her floor once when I left town with nothing but a suitcase and Ellen on my hip. She stared at her plate, suddenly fascinated by gravy. That hurt more than Edward's words. More than Margaret's smile. Ellen stood up so quietly I almost missed it. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady in a way that broke my heart. She didn't wait for permission. She walked away. No one stopped her. Someone kept chewing. Margaret lifted her glass. I stood immediately. My legs felt heavy, but my chest burned. I followed Ellen down the hallway, past framed family photos that told a story I had never quite belonged to. I found her in the bathroom, hands braced on the sink, staring at herself in the mirror. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have worn it." "No," I said, crossing the room and pulling her into my arms. "You did nothing wrong." She clung to me, shaking silently. "We're leaving," I said. She nodded, relieved, cautious. "Are you mad?" she asked. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't yelling. "I'm not mad," I said. "I'm clear." As we walked back toward the hallway, laughter hummed behind closed doors. That's when I understood. This wasn't careless cruelty. It was deliberate. Approved by silence. And in that moment, something inside me locked into place. They thought this night would end with embarrassment. They were wrong. The drive home was quiet in the way only heavy nights can be. Snow drifted across the windshield in soft, uneven lines, blurring the streetlights until everything looked distant and unreal. Ellen sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window like she was trying to memorize the darkness. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, steady, controlled. But inside my chest, something old was unraveling and reweaving itself at the same time. For years, I had convinced myself that moments like the one at the table were misunderstandings. Poor timing. Thoughtless jokes. Personality clashes. I had built an entire survival strategy around minimizing what I felt and maximizing what others could excuse. Tonight stripped that illusion down to nothing. Ellen finally spoke as we turned onto our street. "They don't like me," she said quietly. Not a question. A conclusion. I parked the car and turned toward her fully before answering. "They don't get to decide your worth," I said. "Not now. Not ever." She nodded, but I could see the doubt lingering. 13 is old enough to understand cruelty, but too young to know it isn't deserved. Inside the house, I helped her hang up her coat. She paused in the hallway, looking back at me. "I'm tired," she said. "I know." She disappeared into her room, closing the door gently behind her. I stood there longer than necessary, listening to the silence settle into the walls. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind drifted backward, stitching together years of moments I had tried not to name. The resentment didn't start at Christmas. It started the day I left Riverside Hollow. Margaret never forgave me for that. She stayed, married well, built a life that fit neatly into expectations, took over family traditions like they were heirlooms passed down by blood. When our father offered me help, money, a house nearby, childcare, I said no. I packed instead. I chose a smaller life on my own terms. Margaret smiled when I left, but something sharp lived behind her eyes from that day on. To her, my independence wasn't bravery. It was rejection. Every struggle I survived without asking for help was proof that I didn't need her world. Edward noticed it too. Once, at a holiday years earlier, he joked that I liked playing humble. His family believed success was something you inherited, not built. To them, Ellen wasn't just my daughter. She was evidence of a life that didn't fit their standards. The comments had always been there, wrapped in concern. Is she getting enough exposure? Do you worry about limiting her? Wouldn't she do better with more structure? Questions that sounded caring but were really judgments. They saw her as behind, as less than. Christmas gave them the perfect stage. A long table, an audience, the safety of tradition. They could frame cruelty as honesty and humiliation as humor. And if I reacted emotionally, they could label me difficult, sensitive, dramatic. They had done it before. They assumed I wouldn't risk making a scene. They assumed I would swallow it, smooth it over, and carry the shame home quietly. That was the role they had assigned me years ago. They were wrong. I didn't confront them that night. I didn't raise my voice or demand an apology. Instead, after Ellen went to bed, I pulled out a binder from the back of my closet. The Family Trust. It was thick, organized, untouched for months. I flipped through it calmly, like I was reviewing a project, not preparing to dismantle an illusion. There it was in black and white. Authority. Discretion. Conditions. The trust wasn't just about money. It was about conduct, about stewardship, about protecting beneficiaries, especially minors, from harm. Ellen was named, protected, her dignity written into legal language Margaret had never bothered to read. For years, I had used that authority quietly. When Margaret pushed for early access, I delayed. When Edward tried to reroute funds through creative channels, I said no. When family tensions rose, I smoothed things over, documented everything, and kept the trust stable. They thought I was cautious, passive, grateful to be included at all. They never realized I was protecting them. Every meeting, every call, every gathering where tempers flared and then settled, I wrote notes afterward. Dates, names, exact words. I saved emails, archived messages, kept copies of letters. At first, it was responsibility. After Christmas, it became resolve. The trust did not reward cruelty disguised as tradition. It did not protect people who harmed a minor beneficiary's dignity. I closed the binder and rested my hand on it. I wasn't angry. I was finished pretending. 3 weeks later, the invitation arrived. A necessary family meeting. Estate matters to discuss before the new year. Margaret's name sat neatly at the bottom, confident as ever. I replied yes. The meeting was held in a private room at a quiet restaurant Margaret favored. Important enough to feel official, but insulated from public scrutiny. The kind of place she liked because it made her feel in control. She arrived early, of course. Dressed in tailored cream and gold. Hair perfectly styled. Edward followed close behind, relaxed, smiling like a man expecting a win. Ellen stayed beside me the entire time. She wore a simple navy sweater and jeans. Nothing flashy. Nothing apologetic. She stood straighter than she had weeks ago, her eyes clearer. I had explained everything carefully to her, without bitterness, without rage. I told her she didn't need to speak unless she wanted to. She nodded once and squeezed my hand. Around the table, familiar faces gathered. My mother sat near Margaret, nodding along. Nora smiled nervously, glancing between us. The same people who had laughed at Christmas now leaned forward, expectant. Margaret cleared her throat and began talking before anyone asked her to. She spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about how hard Edward had worked to keep things running smoothly. She mentioned how grateful everyone should be for stability. She didn't look at me once. I listened. Edward chimed in with a joke about paperwork and patience, earning a few chuckles. Someone asked when distributions would resume at the usual rate. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Soon, she said. Everything's in order. I nodded, unreadable. I took notes when necessary. Answered questions briefly when they were directed at me. I didn't interrupt Margaret when she spoke over me. I didn't correct her assumptions. Every word she said dug the hole deeper. At one point, she leaned toward me and said softly, "I'm glad you came. It's important to show unity." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. She believed this meeting proved Christmas hadn't mattered. That I had cooled off. That things were back under control. She was wrong. I let the conversation run its course. Let expectations settle into the room like warm air. I watched people relax, reassured by familiarity and arrogance. They underestimated me exactly the way they always had. And when the table finally turned toward me for confirmation, I met Margaret's gaze steadily. "Thank you all for coming," I said evenly. "There are a few important updates we need to review." The room quieted. Ellen squeezed my hand again, this time with confidence. I opened my folder slowly and placed it on the table. The sound was small, but it carried. The room stayed silent longer than I expected. Not the awkward silence of people waiting for someone else to speak, but the heavier kind. The kind that settles when everyone senses that something irreversible has begun. Margaret's smile didn't disappear right away. It lingered for a moment too long, like her face hadn't yet caught up with reality. Edward leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, still relaxed, still convinced this was all ceremony before the real conversation started. I adjusted the papers in front of me, not rushing. For once, time wasn't working against me. Clause 12, I began calmly. Distribution of trust assets remains contingent upon conduct that upholds family integrity and does not cause harm, public or private, to any named beneficiary. Edward chuckled lightly. Dad really loved his formal language, he said, glancing around the table for agreement. A few people smiled, relieved. Margaret took a sip of water. I continued. Clause 14 grants the executor discretionary authority to pause, review, or restrict access to funds if conduct is determined to be damaging to a minor beneficiary's dignity, safety, or emotional well-being. Edward's smile faltered. "This is getting dramatic," he said. "It was a joke. Everyone knows that." "I'm not finished," I replied. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Someone cleared their throat. I placed a second stack of papers on the table, sliding them forward slowly, deliberately. "These are written statements," I said. "Dates times names. Witness observations from the Christmas gathering. Each taken within 48 hours of the event." Margaret's fingers tightened around her glass. "These," I added, placing another folder beside the first, "are follow-up accounts documenting emotional distress experienced by a named minor beneficiary." Edward sat forward now. "You're recording family?" "I documented harm," I said evenly. "That is my responsibility." Margaret finally spoke, her voice tight. "You're overreacting. This is just you holding a grudge." I turned another page. Clause 16, I read. Any verified violation grants the executor authority to enact temporary suspension of discretionary privileges pending formal review. The silence fell hard. No laughter this time. No interruptions. I looked directly at Margaret. The Christmas incident meets that threshold. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Edward stood halfway, then sat back down slowly, his confidence draining in real time. "You can't do this," Margaret whispered. "I already have," I replied. I gathered the papers neatly, my movements precise. "The review is effective immediately. Notices will be issued by the attorney's office within the week." Edward's voice rose. "This is punishment." "No," I said. "It's procedure." My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Rowan, can't this be worked out?" I shook my head gently. It already was, when Dad put the safeguards in place. Margaret pushed her chair back sharply, standing now, her face flushed. "You've always hated that I stayed," she snapped. "That I built something here." "I left because I needed peace," I said. "What happened at Christmas took that from my daughter." Edward muttered about lawyers. About rights. About fairness. Each word sounded weaker than the last. I waited until the noise settled again. "The review period is set," I said. "Privileges are paused. Access is frozen pending outcome." There was nothing left to argue. The authority was clear. Not loud. Not cruel. Just final. I stood. Ellen rose with me. Margaret stared at the table like it might give her back control. She had spent years believing power came from volume, from status, from being the loudest person in the room. She never realized it had been resting quietly in my hands the entire time. No one stopped us as we walked out. The hallway felt longer on the way back, the air colder. The door closed softly behind us, and the noise of the family stayed trapped on the other side. Outside, the night was sharp and clean. Ellen walked beside me, her steps steady, her shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. When we reached the car, I paused before unlocking it. "You okay?" I asked. She nodded. "You didn't yell." "I didn't need to." She thought about that as we drove. "They were loud," she said finally. "But you were stronger." The words settled deep. At a red light, she reached for my hand. "I thought I did something wrong," she admitted. "If I dressed better, talked more." "People who decide your worth before knowing you will always find a reason," I said. "That was never about you." She leaned her head against the window, watching the lights pass. "So dignity isn't about them liking you?" "No," I said. "It's about protecting yourself when they don't." When we got home, the house was quiet and warm. No forced smiles. No polished perfection. Just space to breathe. Ellen hung up her jacket and disappeared into her room, lighter somehow. That night, I felt no regret. I hadn't destroyed anything that wasn't already cracked. I had just stopped pretending it was whole. And if this story resonated with you, please comment, and subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. Your support helps stories like this reach people who need to hear that quiet strength still matters, and that protecting your child is never the wrong choice.